Hey folks, welcome back. This is Andy with the Poor Proles Almanac. This is part 2 of our conversation with Brett Chedzoy. If you haven't listened to part 1, hop over to the episode before this and take a listen. For the rest of you, let's continue forward with this interview. Now, when we're talking about these details of, like, you were just saying, if you've got like a couple acres, you could do it by hand. I'm wondering about the actual thinning process in terms of what you think about. Is it something where it's like pulling a Band-Aid off, or do you think there's a succession process where you don't want to thin everything at once and you take a couple trees every year for 3 or 4 years until to help it transition, as opposed to trying to do it so quickly?
I think, Andy, that lighter, more frequent thinnings are more favorable from a silvopasture management objective than the way we typically do it in forestry, where we go in there with the heavy metal and we do one big thinning, one big harvest all at once, and then we come back again in 10 to 20 years and do it again. The reason I think that the lighter, more frequent thinnings are more favorable for silvopasturing is, well, I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. One is trees are very opportunistic. So if we create holes in the canopy by cutting out, weeding out some of the trees, the branches of those trees quickly fill in those gaps. So you're only creating a fairly short-term duration of higher sunlight levels. So going in there and thinning, say, more like on a 3 to 5 year rotation versus a 10 to 15 year rotation is going to be able to sustain the higher sunlight down within a few feet of the ground, which is where it's really doing us the most good to grow forages. The other reason I like lighter, more frequent thinnings is trees don't like change any more than we do. So if you go in there and take too many trees out at once, it can shock them and create some other unintended consequences, such as wind damage or what we call epicormic branching, which is not really a serious issue, especially in silvopasturing trees, but that's where latent buds in these otherwise high value trees start to sprout and you get like the porcupine looking tree. And thirdly, though, I think that a gradual transition is best, but we have to balance all this with what is feasible and operable. So the way I think it works best for many farms and many projects is that you initially work with forestry professionals, meaning foresters and loggers, to go in there and get the bulk of it done in an initial big harvest. And this is your opportunity to capture the value of some of the trees that are being thinned out. But after that, we need to develop at least the basic skills of how to go in there and continually thin, not, again, necessarily every year, but perhaps every several years, go in there and do light firewood harvests, or it can be just cutting the trees down, leaving them on the ground, or it can be girdling them and leaving them there as standing habitat for insects and birds and other forest critters. In those trees that we do in these following thinnings, are the opportunity cost of not putting those on a log truck and sending them to a point of sale is usually pretty low, but it's not like an all in one fell swoop type of process.
So you had mentioned earlier about that you leave your stumps in the ground. I wanted to ask a little bit about that because I every time I look out in my area where the sheep are, and I just see these like stumps sticking up, and I'm like, I got to do something with them, but I don't know what. So I want to know a little bit more about your thought process and the benefits of doing it the way you are.
Let me clarify and say, I'm not saying you couldn't take the stumps out, but I don't think you benefit or gain much by taking the stumps out. First of all, taking relatively fresh stumps out you're going to do more harm than good. Just a lot of soil disturbance, a lot of impact to the root systems of the remaining trees. Now, if you leave the stumps there for a few years, you could probably almost push them out with a compact tractor afterwards, at least the smaller stumps. And we often do that in our silvopastures some years down the road because we want to improve the access through there. But there's no important reason why we need to remove the stumps. The only situations where I've seen people remove stumps in their silvopastures is where they're trying to have like a really, like they are trying to do a really short-term conversion to like a really perfect looking silvopasture. And if that's what your objectives are, then maybe not taking the stumps out, but at least spending that extra money to cut them very low to the ground might be,
or grind them or whatever.
yep. And
Yeah.
managing slash, by the way, sometimes it's more cost effective to go in there after the fact and have something like a forestry mulching machine. There's many different types and models. Go in there and grind up the slash, or take an excavator and consolidate it into piles and windrows after the fact than to pay the loggers. But that's one of the other advantages of working with a professional forester is the foresters usually know how to take what your goal is and try to figure out a way of having the loggers do it quicker, better, faster, cheaper than paying somebody else after the fact to do it.
Okay, that makes sense. And like I said, it's more of an aesthetics thing. And there's a couple stumps and spots that I'm kind of running trying to eventually organize more of a keyline design to the placement. And there's a couple stumps just in like the worst possible spots. And I've been trying to figure out what exactly to do with them, but I might just work around them and leave them as is.
So you take out the stumps in those worst possible spots and let the rest of them stop bugging you. So
yeah, probably be the best idea.
A little trick I learned, and I have not had a chance to experiment with this on our own farm, but the way they clear stumps there is when they cut off the living tree, they put a high phosphorus fertilizer on the stump. The stump absorbs that phosphorus and basically makes it a match head. So it also basically keeps the stump from resprouting. It poisons the tree. And they go back usually a year later and take a shovel full of hot coals and dump it on that phosphorus-rich stump, and it not only burns the stump down below the soil surface, but a lot of the roots as well. So,
oh, that's an interesting idea.
I've never seen it done here, but I saw it work very successfully down in Argentina, and I don't know why it wouldn't work here. So,
yeah. So I think all of this for me comes back to I think it's pretty straightforward when you have good conditions. And I know you've talked in the past about whether or not it's worth the investment of trying to make a site that has poor conditions, whether that's super low pH or unvaluable trees or bedrock or any of those things. If you do have those conditions and that this is the site you have and you can't move, what are your thoughts on what that process should look like?
Yeah, and you may have seen this, Andy, before, but we developed a 10-question exercise some years ago on how to evaluate the site potential for silvopasturing. So we have this archived on our forestry extension webpage. So search for Cornell Forestry should get you there. And I think the title of the document is something like Site Evaluations for Silvopastures, but it's really more of a thinking it through exercise, and we try to simplistically boil it down into 10 questions, but you could probably ask yourself half as many important questions or far more questions, but it's to look at things like inherent site quality, what's currently growing there, what wants to grow there, the ability to get water and fence and all those things out there, because it's not just the trees and the forage. You have to have these other must things like being able to keep the animals on site, and water, and access. But I think site quality, that is a very, very important characteristic to look at. And you keep talking about the example of pine and acidic loving plants like lowbush blueberry or huckleberry. I worked for years as a consulting forester in southern New England, so I know very well what your
so you're in my territory.
I know very well what your forests look like, or what much of your forests look like. And we have to know what these potential bottlenecks are before we just jump into this, because if you have a if you're trying to take a woods and turn it into silvopasture, but your soil pH is far below what would be considered an acceptable threshold for decent growth of cool season forages, then you, you have two choices. Either you do it and it fails because all you continue to grow there are plants that the animals don't really like. In other words, plants that don't have good feed value for grazing livestock, or you have to make investments in amending the soil and correcting that pH limitation, and that is most typically spreading lime or gypsum, which is a significant expense, but not I think, an unsurmountable expense. So this, going back to this example I gave earlier of a friend that did a 70-acre silvopasture harvest in his woods, before we did the harvest there, I encouraged him to pull some soil samples, which he did. These soil samples literally only cost about $15 each. So I think he ended up breaking his 70 acres into 2 or 3 different kind of sites that he thought he might have different soil types and different pH readings. So, for an investment of like less than $50, he was able to identify not only what the macronutrient levels were in there, but more importantly, the pH. And he ended up deciding to spread lime in a portion of that 70 acres. I don't know if it was half. It wasn't just a few acres. Like he brought several truckloads of lime in and I think he spread it at a rate of just a ton an acre, which is pretty modest. But in the areas where he spread lime, the forages are definitely looking better here at the end of the second growing season. I was out there a couple weeks ago, and we were looking at areas where he grazed the pigs through versus no pig impact. We were looking at areas where he put down lime versus no lime. We were also looking at areas where he had done seeding with a different mix or a higher seeding rate. And I guess the takeaway I would share is that where he invested more, he got better results. I couldn't tell you that was
sure
in the long run what is ultimately going to be the most profitable, but we have to know what these, like, okay, I got to fix this or it's just not going to move forward conditions are, and pH is definitely one of those. So, and I don't know that a standard soil sample gives us great insight into soil pH, because typically soil samples have instructions like, okay, you dig down, you clear the sod or the organic matter at the surface, and you dig down about 6 inches. I don't know how forest soils might differ in that regard than what we would think of as like agricultural soils. So, I think we typically have a shallow acidic layer at the soil surface where you have that undecomposed or partially decomposed duff layer, the old leaf layer. And I don't know if that carries down into the soil, like say to a 6-inch rooting depth. But forest soil, one reason that soils are left to revert back to forest is because they weren't probably the best soils to begin with. And that said, you can think of woods that are growing on tremendously productive soils and sites, and you can think of forests that, trees are doing fine there, but frankly, nothing else would. So, but, spend a little bit of money up front and really know what you're walking into.
Sure, absolutely. So, to kind of go in a different direction, I want to ask, everyone that I know that's a farmer kind of has a weird pet project. So mine is like honey locusts. Like, I think they're an extremely underutilized tree, and I'm very interested in utilizing the pods and the sugar in the pods, and I haven't seen a lot of research on it, and it's something I'm playing with a little bit. So do you have any of those types of projects where you're just doing something that you're almost like, I don't want to say embarrassed, but like it's just like something that's totally kind of off the wall in terms of agriculture?
I'm smirking here because my reflexive response as it seems like everything we do here is off the wall. And I know the neighbors drive by our farm, and we have 2 public roads that run through our farm, and I'm definitely the oddball of the neighborhood. The one thing that we do, and it gets us in trouble a little bit, so it's not really directly tied to silvopasturing, but we never park our herds. We're grazing about 500 contiguous acres here on the home farm, and we have about 100 cow calf pairs. So we're a cow calf operation. We have found, well, when our herd was even half that size, we found that if we left them in any one place for very long, they just made a tremendous amount of mud. One thing I would add about our farm, and it's why our farm's name is Angus Glen Farms, is that we have over a mile of border on the Watkins Glen State Park Gorge. So this is a very special, pristine watershed that 2 million people come to our little county to visit every year. It's the second most visited park in New York after Niagara Falls. I do not want to be the farm that's putting nutrients in that watershed. And 2 miles downstream through this beautiful State Park Gorge is Seneca Lake, which is kind of the heart of our Finger Lakes wine region and tourism. So no doubt about it, farms can be part of the solution or part of the problem. More and more often, they seem to be part of the problem in terms of dumping nutrients into sensitive watersheds. One of the ways, so when we were getting to that point where it was like, okay, are we going to grow beyond having a little tiny herd of cows? Back about 17, 18 years ago, we were getting to the point where it was time to make some decisions about how we were going to fix this or spend huge amounts of money trying to build some sort of covered feeding structures on our farm. I had a friend from the Soil and Water Conservation District that came up and took a hard look and didn't sugarcoat anything. He said, you could spend $100,000 trying to fix your barnyard, and it's not really going to solve the problem. And that plus the realization that animals, particularly ruminant animals that have built-in anaerobic digesters, if we're feeding them well and giving them some shelter from severe winter weather, can otherwise do perfectly fine in the cold. We realized, okay, we don't need to keep our animals confined to a muddy barnyard all winter. So we are rotationally bale grazing around the farm. And in any given winter, we might utilize 2/3 of the total paddocks or pasture base to rotationally graze round bales. And it's just something that's not really seen around here much with livestock farms and particularly beef farms. Consequently, we've been reported to the sheriff's animal control officer, who's a good friend of mine, knows very well what we're doing numerous times. But people drive by and there's like, oh, look at those cows out there in the snow and they're not in a barn and that must be bad for them. And we have a couple roof shelters on the farm, and the animals can always get access to some type of shelter. It's usually more like our dense spruce areas that we call our living barns, that we don't necessarily manage those as silvopastures for forage production, but we still thin the trees out and try to promote the growth of the best trees there. The cows can always have access to some type of shelter, especially when the weather's bad, and yet they stand out there and happily lay around their round bales chewing their cud. And it's just given me a realization that the animals look at it a little differently than we do. But
Sure.
that still requires, though, having healthy animals with good body condition, being able to recognize when they really might need better shelter than just because it's going to be a little bit cold outside. So
Sure. And breed plays into that too.
definitely breed. I think more than breed, just certainly some breeds are better acclimated than others, but biotypes, I really think the answer to a lot of our problems in the livestock world is to eat your problems. That might offend some people, but trying to manage for the weakest few is putting everybody at a disadvantage. And if we have animals that are struggling or suffering, we do everything we can to help those animals, but we don't give that same level of care and attention to the whole group because the rest of the group doesn't need it. We'll take those animals out and see if we can get them back on their feet or give them what they need, but long term, they're not going to remain in our herd.
Sure. I have Icelandic sheep, and a big reason I got them is because of their genetics and the fact that they've been bred pretty much to be able to do that. So like during the winter, I'll open up their house, which is portable, so I can rotate the house because it's only a couple of them, and they like get mad at me when I'm like, go in. It's nighttime. It's like 5 degrees out, and they just want to like hang outside.
Animals don't like to be confined. I mean, we don't like to be confined. We all learned that last year. So we can't judge what we think our animals needs based on what our needs are, but we can't be ignorant of what our animals need either. I love sheep, by the way, because they're out there digging through the deepest of snow, trying to find that last little blade of green grass. They don't want to touch that hay bale. If there's still some little clump of grass out there they can find under the snow, they're looking for it.
Drives me crazy when you buy second cut and they're just looking at you like, you want me to eat this? Like, yes. You know how much money that cost? Kills me. Hey there, it's Andy from the Poor Proles Almanac. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast. As you can probably tell, this content involves extensive research and editing to release weekly episodes. If you think this content is valuable for the future that we inherit, please consider financially supporting this project by visiting poorproles.com and clicking on the Patreon, Venmo, Ko-Fi, or PayPal tabs. Every dollar helps offset our costs for hosting the podcast content and helps offset hundreds of hours of work put towards this project monthly. Thank you for supporting us by sharing, liking, and donating to this project. Together, we can build a better future. So, I think my last real question for you is, it's a doozy. So, we've talked a lot about like ecology and agriculture and how these things interplay with each other. In reality, there's like a third major component that I don't see addressed in anything other than lip service, which is the role that climate change plays in how we think about what our ecology looks like today, what it looks like in the future, and where do these food systems kind of integrate with what the future holds for us, not just in terms of temperature, but water and all the other things that come with it.
Well, you definitely saved the best for last, Andy. I'll give you a quick comment, and then we can continue to discuss this. I really think the answer moving forward in how are we going to survive and sustainably and ethically meet our needs, particularly around food, is to build more resiliency into the systems. And I really think silvopastures are one of the best examples out there of a resilient food production system and so much more than food. I think the ecosystem services and the fact that we're also producing forest products in our silvopastures, it's a healthy watershed. It's great habitat. It's this like high value edge habitat that many wildlife species really thrive in, because again, it's working with nature. There's this the technical term is biomimicry, but we're taking something that looks a lot like a naturally occurring ecosystem and working with it. That's, to me, gives it inherently a high degree of resilience to withstand, okay, not just the ups and downs of markets, which are a fact of life in the agricultural world, but if silvopastures have saved our bacon numerous times in recent years on our farm, and I'll give you examples just from the last 2 years. So in the summer 2020, we had a drought of historic proportions where we had 3 inches of rain from early May till late September. So that's just unheard of here. And if you looked on the drought monitor map, I know it was quite droughty out through much of New England and where you are too, but we were some little tiny pixel on the National Drought Monitor map that didn't even raise the eyebrows of the federal agencies. Consequently, it was like ignored. But when you get 3 inches of rain in a 4-month peak growing season, you really see the impacts of it. The silvopastures not only allowed us to utilize land that we already own to sustain our livestock, but and honestly, the forages look better in the silvopasture areas and grew better than they did out where the forages were burned up by early summer. Plus, we had this ability to go in there and do some of that light thinning, which let the animals have some additional supplementation. So it wasn't necessarily what filled their bellies, but it gave them something to supplement the low quality hay that we were forced to feed them during parts of the summer. This summer, it's just the opposite. We are drowning in water, and I guess when you take the 2 years and average them, everything's normal, right? But from one extreme to the other, and yet now having this additional silvopasture acreage. So our farm originally was about half fields, half woods. And if we fenced out the woods and just said, okay, that's our woods, we cut firewood there, we hunt deer there in the fall, we go out and hike in our woods, that would be a big missed opportunity looking at the way I look at things today. But by using our woods, which is largely on the same sites and soils and slopes and is our fields. So in other words, there was really no reason why we couldn't develop this into silvopasture, but by using it as silvopasture, it allows us to keep the animals moving around a much larger grazing base and spread that impact out of when our soils are saturated. And obviously we have to do that a little bit more carefully in the silvopastures for the reasons we talked about earlier about not damaging tree roots and compacting soils. But it also gives us an ability to, so one of the other challenges this summer was not just the rain, but the humidity caused by that rain. So we had some heat index days here in early August that were just brutal. And because we use rotational grazing, we always try to keep our silvopastures for those times of the year where we think they're going to be most strategically valuable. So like the dog days of summer is really what we're shooting for, to have them in our prime silvopasture areas. And the animals, no doubt, enjoy being in those shaded silvopastures much more than they do suffering out in the hot, humid sunshine.
So I got a question for you. I know I said that was my last one, but now I got to know, how has silvopasture impacted the hunt in terms of like how much you could utilize your silvopasture for that use?
So this is going to be largely anecdotal. When we first started fencing, so this was a family dairy farm until the mid 80s, and then was being cropped by a tenant farmer through much of the 90s. When we settled back here in the early 2000s, we started to fence in the old pastures again, and the bits and pieces of the farm that weren't being leased to this other row crop farmer. And I was hesitant to do so because I felt like putting the fences up was going to deter the wildlife, particularly the deer, which was something that was especially important to my dad, who enjoys deer hunting. And I didn't see any diminishment whatsoever of, in fact, I would say that the hunting continued to be as good as ever. And then as we slowly started developing more and more of the areas where we thought of as like kind of the deer habitat into silvopastures, I also felt that was going to discourage deer from transitioning through the farm and reduce the quality of our hunting experiences. And I would say it's been really just the opposite, because what I've come to appreciate is that pretty much all wildlife, they want two things. They want food and shelter. And I think silvopastures offer the best of both worlds for wildlife in that regard, that there's more places to hide in a silvopasture than there are out in the corn stubble field, or for that matter, the pasture. But there's also, unlike the woods where there's typically just plants growing in the understory that the deer don't like to eat, there's all sorts of yummy stuff there. If it's good for our livestock, it's good for the wildlife too. So, and I remember back to forestry school, they used to always emphasize the importance of edge habitat, that transition between field and forest. So I think of silvopastures as an extensive edge habitat where you have, again, that win-win situation. The animals have something to eat, but they also have some place to hide or some place to take refuge. So I think silvopastures, honestly, if we were calling silvopastures, like if we were selling it as a wildlife habitat enhancement, it might be a little bit more socially acceptable than saying, though, this is just, for farmers to make more money. But the truth of the matter is that all the wildlife biologists that have come to visit our farm and have come to our wildlife or our silvopasture trainings, they totally acknowledge that silvopastures, they're not good for necessarily every wildlife species out there. Like maybe a true grassland obligate might be, you might be reducing the quality of the habitat by planting trees into the grassland environment, or a deep forest obligate might not like the fact that you created some disturbance and kind of changed the structure of the forest. But I think silvopastures probably do the greatest good for the greatest number of wildlife.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's also how the indigenous people managed a lot of this landscape to not necessarily be a silvopasture, but very similar that oak savanna environment, essentially.
Absolutely. Biome. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something that in a lot of our silvopasture talks, we try to emphasize that, for this maybe 100-year period, or the better part of a century at least, we had this paradigm of like, keep animals out. And I think it was the right advice at the time, but historically we have to look back a little further and realize that even though the indigenous cultures weren't necessarily herdsmen here in the Northeast, they wanted to do things that kept the game close to home. So having a deep, dark forest with nothing for the animals to eat underneath those mature canopies, that wasn't what kept the deer and the turkey and other game species close and accessible. So I think that having these relatively open savanna-like woodlands, a silvopasture is a savanna-like ecosystem. I think that was much more widely maintained on the landscape by indigenous cultures than we realize historically, largely through the use of fire.
I mean, fire, I think, in a lot of ways is a lot quicker than a lot of the practices we do today, especially given the technology they were working with and not relying on fossil fuels and things like that. So it was an efficient way to do, forest management.
Fire would be a wonderful tool for managing our silvopastures, but it's unfortunately something where we've just boxed ourselves out of using it here in much of the Northeast. We've really lost our knowledge of fire science here in the Northeast, and we're usually working with such narrow windows of opportunity anyhow. There's still some of the national forests here in the Northeast, like the Finger Lakes National Forest in my backyard, they use fire, but it's a very labor intensive process for them. Some of the state forests here still use prescribed fire, and it works great for what their objectives are. But you look in the southeastern U.S. or western U.S. where fire is used in a constructive, productive way versus just the wildfires that we hear about. That, by the way, prescribed burns would really be the fix for wildfires.
Yeah, and I think like climate change has played into how we can utilize it because we don't have those consistent seasons the way we might have 100 years ago.
Yeah. I know that our local national forest, I know the forestry and conservation people there quite well, and they really, they could almost used to be, they could almost set their clocks by when they would have the right conditions to do their prescribed burns around mid-March every year. And anymore, it could be anywhere from February to May when they get that week of just the right conditions to go out there and burn, because it's much more complicated than just lighting fires on the ground.
Absolutely. So, Brett, for folks that are interested in hearing you talk more, where would you recommend folks go check out your work?
Probably the easy way, Andy, is for people to do a internet search for Cornell silvopasture. Would get you to one of two main resource sites that we maintain. One is our forestry extension site, which I already mentioned. The website address is forestconnect.info. And we also have a silvopasture forum, which has a bit more complicated URL. That's silvopasture.ning.com. And that's meant to be more of a social network for people interested in silvopasturing, but we also use it as a repository to archive information. So if there was a good webinar or a good article on silvopasturing, or something else that we need to put it there where people can find it in the future, it usually goes on that silvopasture.ning.com site. Those are kind of the two main places. And by the way, on the forestry extension page, you have to dig a little bit. It's under publications, and then there's a section on silvopasturing. We are looking forward to doing a 2-day silvopasture tour in this area. It's most likely going to be next August. We've had to reschedule it twice for obvious reasons, and because I want to have everybody come and have a good time and feel comfortable sitting on tour buses as we go around to some great farms in this area. And it's not meant to be the nitty-gritty hands-on of how to silvopasture, but really show folks that come and attend some examples of silvopasturing on farms that are all doing it a little bit differently and kind of different contexts. And the way to find out about that, we hope to advertise in some of the major grazing publications starting next spring. But if you join that silvopasture forum, we know you're not going to sit there every evening and read through the content and post stuff, but by being a member of that forum, when we do an event like that, we can message all the forum members, and that might be 2 or 3 times a year, but it's a way of letting you know that something important is coming up.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have any social media handles or anything that for folks that want to either see your farm or just see silvopasture stuff through Cornell or anything like that?
So my understanding is there's a silvopasture Facebook group out there. I don't find the hours in the day to do much with social media. That's the downside of being a forester, or being a farmer. So Cornell gets the first 50 hours a week on the forestry side, and the farm gets the next 50. So it doesn't leave a lot for Instagram or Facebook. And
sure,
we have a lot of stuff archived, though, in terms of webinars. There's been a lot of great things published on silvopasturing in the Northeast, and your audience isn't all tuning in from the Northeast, but there's a number of other institutions that are doing great work with silvopasturing. A couple that I would give a plug to is obviously University of Missouri, the Center for Agroforestry, the folks at Virginia Tech are doing some great work with silvopasturing. There's more and more universities that are trying to get a silvopasturing program going because they all recognize we've worked with the folks at Michigan State here in recent years to get their own silvopasturing extension program up and going, and Minnesota's done some work, Wisconsin's done some work, but University of Vermont is definitely doing some work. One of our colleagues, Joe Orifice, he's over at Yale, and Joe's kind of been the third leg of the stool on the silvopasturing extension over the years. We have other people at Cornell like Steve Gabriel. You had mentioned him earlier. Steve wrote a book, which I think is a very great starting point for people to kind of get the inspiration for silvopasturing from. It's just, to me, it's like there's so much opportunity out there that we need to figure out how to better respond in the world of extension, because we're all doing this largely as a extracurricular activity, and there's more and more farmers that are really figuring out how to do this well, but their time is precious too. And that's what that tour, the goals of the tour are next year, is to create an opportunity for us all to get together, all kind of see and talk about the same things.
One of the things to me that's really interesting about silvopasture is it's one of the only fields that I know of where like normal people that don't have a specialty and advanced degree can go and learn something new that no one else has figured out before, because it's such a new field in terms of how we're thinking about growing food.
I know that I'm 52 now, Andy, and I know if I make it another, I'll farm till the day I die, but if that's 30 more years or 40 more years, I'll probably feel at that point that I still know only a little tiny bit of what there is to know about silvopasturing. That's what keeps it fun for me. It's much like forestry. I mean, the book is far from written on knowing our forests and knowing how to best care for our forests. So the same is true for farming, but we're getting more and more black and white all the time with how to grow things like row crop or produce milk. But I think with silvopastures, grazing is always going to be the artful application of science. And for everything we learn, we'll realize there's so much more that we need to keep learning.
Absolutely. Brett, this was really great. I appreciate your time.
Andy, thank you for the opportunity to come in and share a little bit of this. I hope that others will step forward and become the new experts on silvopasturing, but it's all something that we're going to learn by doing. So we can watch webinars and read books, and
got to get your hands dirty.
Got to get your hands dirty. There's no substitute for experience.